Consider this question. What defines a national identity? Is it the geographical location, sports, language, culture, ethnicity? How do you define, for instance, the American national identity? What about Japan, South Africa, Spain? And to get into the topic of this video essay, Palestine, a state that, according to the 4 principles in the Montevideo Convention, does not actually meet the criteria of being a sovereign state. Many parts of the region is under Israel control, it does not have a clearly defined border, and it cannot establish foreign relations, as the interim agreement on the West Bank and Gaza Strip, or commonly known as Oslo II, clearly forbids so. But what indeed does the national identity, or the lack of it, entail? This is the question that is discussed in depth in many Palestinian films throughout the decades, including the film that this essay will be focusing on, a comedy drama film called It Must Be Heaven by director Elia Suleiman, made in 2019. Unlike many Palestinian films that are realistic and therefore serious in tone, Suleiman's works adopt a comedic flair, creating a diegesis where the events or objects from real life are exaggerated to create a sense of absurdity and irony. The plot of the film follows the journey of Suleiman himself as he travels away from his homeland, Palestine, to Paris and New York, where he finds himself greeted with similar experiences despite the drastically different landscapes. The film predominantly unfolds through the perspective of Suleiman, as he's always in the center of the screen, assuming the role of an observer or flaneur as he traverses the streets of different cities. Suleiman heavily utilizes the reverse shot pattern to present his observations, which simultaneously creates an effect that detaches Suleiman from his surroundings and the objects of his observations. In other words, Suleiman never appears in the same frame with the world he observes, and the camera, unlike a conventional filmmaking method that places it on the side of the interacting characters as not to impede their interactions, is always directly in between Suleiman and the world, drawing a clear line that separates them. Moreover, the gap between Suleiman and his surrounding is underscored by the lack of communication, accentuated with elements of visual comedy. In this scene that takes place early on in the film, we see Suleiman sitting at the center of the frame in what appears to be a restaurant, staring toward the camera, as if seeing something behind it. It then cuts to what he sees: 3 persons in a similarly symmetrical composition, 2 of them equally staring over the camera just like Suleiman, establishing an eye-line match which is confirmed by the next shot, where the audience sees him looking at each other. However, what happens next goes completely against the expectations that the first 3 shots have established. The characters on the left engage in an argument with the owner of the restaurant, to which Suleiman is completely irrelevant. Similar techniques are employed throughout the film not only as a source of visual comedy, but also to convey a message pivotal to the film: the failure of communication. In the entirety of 98 minutes, there are only few instances of dialogue, and Suleiman himself never utters a word except for one scene. When people look at each other, they do not speak. When one character talks, the other one responds with silence. And when they do engage in a conversation, they refuse to look at each other and only utters hateful words. But what is causing this failure of communication between people? What, for Suleiman, has rendered verbal language ineffective and meaningless? Let's look at this one scene where one of Suleiman's film projects gets rejected by a French producer.
Monsieur Suleiman, merci. Merci d'abord de nous avoir apporté ce projet. Comme vous le savez, c'est la typologie de projet qui nous intéresse. C'est un film sur le conflit palestinien et vous savez, on a une certaine sympathie pour la cause palestinienne. Alors, ce n'est pas du tout une question de vouloir faire un film très didactique ou exotique sur la Palestine, mais c'est vrai qu'on pourrait dire presque qu'on n'a pas trouvé ça assez palestinien, assez, et c'est pas pour des raisons commerciales, puisque vous savez bien que ce genre de films, hélas, ne sont pas les films qui font recette. On ne les fait pas pour ça, on les fait parce qu'on pense qu'on se rend utile, mais ce n'est pas un projet qui correspondrait à notre ligne éditoriale, dans le sens où on a l'impression que ça se passe en Palestine, mais si ça se passait ailleurs, ça serait la même chose. Ça pourrait même se passer ici. Donc je ne pense pas qu'on va donner suite. On aurait beaucoup aimé le faire, bien entendu. Malgré l'excitation qu'on avait, je pense que nous n'irons pas plus loin sur ce projet.
The words of the producer that something can be, quote, not Palestinian enough implies that there indeed exists a Palestinian identity against which a film, or anything for that matter, can be judged as Palestinian or not. Furthermore, he states that the film could even take place here in France, asserting that although it is unknown what that is considered Palestinian looks like, it is expected to be different from something that is considered French or Western. In other words, the producer sees the world as a clearly defined partition between us and them, and so whatever happens in Palestine is expected to be different so that this dichotomy can be held valid. The silence of Suleiman as a response, therefore, is not actually out of his own will, but his recognition of the futility of his own voice. In Edward Said's Orientalism, he notably writes that underlying all Orientalist discourse is a set of representative figures, or tropes. These figures are to the actual Orient as stylized costumes are to characters in the play. In other words, we need not to look for correspondence between the language used to depict the Orient and the Orient itself, not so much because the language is inaccurate, but because it is not even trying to be accurate. What it is trying to do is at one and the same time to characterize the Orient as alien and to incorporate it schematically on the theatrical stage whose audience, manager, and actors are for Europe and only for Europe. Therefore, even though the producer stresses that the company is not trying to depict an exotic image of Palestine in their films, Palestine is still alienated and otherized in the Western perspective because of the Middle East conflict, which has become the new trope and costumes for the Palestine in the Western discourse. Similarly, the same idea is expressed in the scene where Suleiman is interviewed at a New York school.
I will start by asking you to share with us your experience as a filmmaker and to speak about the ways of being and feeling that have or have not permitted you to achieve the conditions of becoming what we call a citizen of the world. Is your sense, your identity of place a thing of the past? Has your nomadic existence extinguished your love of one place and extended it to a love of all places? In other words, are you a perfect stranger?
Suleiman again responds with silence, simply because his identity has already been written by the Western colonial discourse. He is deprived of all agency to talk for himself except to shape his own life, his identity, his film, in accordance with the projected images of him and his country that existed exclusively in the Western discourse. Said argues that the otherization, the contrast between Western writing and Oriental silence, is a result of and a sign of the West's great cultural strength, its will to power over the Orient. But what indeed is this Western strength? What is the Western identity that is clearly separated from the East and from Palestine? In It Must Be Heaven, Suleiman reveals the nature of this national identity with this scene. Two sanitation workers are attracted by the image of the French military parade. They drop their work and watch, mesmerized as the television displays images symbolizing power, authority, and nation. The sharp contrast between the workers and the images on TV shows that national identity is the superimposition of power and authority onto individuals, creating a hegemony of discourse. While people are not necessarily defined by or related to symbols of national identity, the internalization of the national discourse allows people to draw a clear distinction between us, the nationals, and others, the foreigners, to form an identity that is built solely on exclusion. Moreover, in this scene, the irony also comes from what Homi Bhabha terms mimicry. Before being attracted to the television, the sanitary workers are seen playing golf, except not with real golf balls or clubs, but with broomsticks and soda cans. The image of the working class engaging in an upper class sport achieves what Homi Bhabha calls almost the same, but not quite. In his article of Mimicry and a Man, Bhabha writes that the mimicry of the colonizer's way of life carried out by the colonized is, in itself, a parody because it problematizes the signs of racial and cultural priority so that the national is no longer naturalizable. Indeed, The juxtaposition of working-class subjects and upper-class symbols in this frame articulates a question detrimental to the idea of nation that tries to hide the drastic inequality in Western societies and reveals the hegemonical nature of the concept of national identity as a purely artificial construct. The existence of national identity, therefore, according to Suleiman, is the source why communication does not work. To borrow Said, it is not that it does not work, it is that it is not supposed to work in the first place. Genuine communications between cultures have to be broken down to better insulate groups of people into exclusive power hierarchies that are concealed by the discourse of nationalism, which also shield issues such as inequality, racism, and such, to legitimize power of the ruling class. Even when Suleiman refuses to partake in the system with his silence, it is not enough. Suleiman's interaction with his surrounding reveals that the world operates on the principle that every individual, even states, need to be clearly defined in their name,
Are you Brigitte?
their ethnicity,
What country do you come from?
borders,
3,90 m.
just so to tell you apart from me and to tell them apart from us. And there really is no escape from this, as Suleiman is constantly being trapped on screen both physically and metaphorically. The involuntary camera movement with him at the center, while seemingly gives him agency as the observer, actually traps him in the frames without any chances for escape. When he utters his only line in the film that states his nationality,
I'm Palestinian.
it is a metaphor for not only his, but everyone's inevitable compromise to the system of definition that permeates our life, our society, and even international and intercultural communications. In an interview, Suleiman clearly states his opinion on the idea of a national identity. He says, "I don't want to tell the story of Palestine. My right as a Palestinian lost its meaning as a point of departure for my work, at least politically speaking. Of course, I am aware of people's need to share a common language, way of life, safety, and democracy, but I will always doubt this collective institution called nation. The concept root is meaningless for me. Cinema is not meant to reinforce the national image or its opposite, the negative image of the other. It Must Be Heaven, therefore, can be interpreted as a film that seeks to transcend the barrier of national identity. It reveals for us, with light-hearted comedy wrapped around a serious topic, that individuals are never exclusively defined through their relationship regarding their country. And it is exactly this artificial national identity that impedes interpersonal communication and renders voices useless. And to conclude this video, I want to use Suleiman's own words. If I make films, he says, it is in order to create a better potential reality. It is in order to bring down barriers, not to create them. It is in order to liberate us from all rules and regulations imposed on us by the structures of power, in order to experience pleasure and to seek the desire and all else we lack in the present, as intensely as possible."